Revenge is a kind of wild justice. The Riverside Motel had been closed for years and was waiting for demolition, though several rooms were still occupied, not by guests, but by people who wanted no registration and no questions. A worker inspecting the far wing found the body. The room was locked from the inside, and through a cracked window, he saw a man on the floor. Firefighters had forced the door before I arrived. The victim was Richard Sloan, 63, a former homicide detective and, for the last 15 years, a private investigator. His wallet, identification, expensive watch, and car keys were still on him. There was no struggle and no blood. Sloan lay beside the bed as though he had simply collapsed. The room held a broken wardrobe, a mattress, one chair, and an old cassette answering machine on the bedside table. The telephone line had been cut. Near the door was a typed card, "Lock the door." A second card lay beside the machine, "Pick up the receiver, press play." The interior bolt was locked, the window was sealed, and years of dirt around its frame were undisturbed. Brooks would determine how Sloan died. I wanted to know why a successful private investigator had come to a place everyone else had forgotten. The people living inside the motel disliked police and questions equally. Most saw nothing. One man remembered Sloan only because his coat was worth more than everything else in the building. Sloan arrived alone, entered the far wing, and spoke to no one. His car remained outside, but his phone held a message received 2 hours before death. The motel address, room number, meeting time, and a photograph of an old audio cassette. No name, no explanation, no threat. The prepaid number no longer answered. Sloan told no one where he was going. He canceled 2 meetings and drove to Riverside alone. Whatever the cassette meant, it had told him enough. By morning, Brooks had completed the preliminary autopsy. He found no fatal injury, strangulation, injection mark, acute cardiac event, or dangerous level of alcohol, narcotics, or common medication. There was mild pulmonary edema and irritation in the airways, possible signs of exposure to an unknown substance, but not proof. Blood and tissue went for expanded toxicology. Until the results returned, Sloan's death remained unexplained. Everything from the room was already in the lab: his clothing, the typed cards, and the telephone answering machine. I asked Lucas to begin with the machine. One card had ordered Sloan to pick up the receiver and press play. We did not know whether that instruction had killed him, but it was the first thing worth testing. Lucas called that evening. The telephone looked old. Inside, it had been completely rebuilt. A small container beneath the casing fed into the receiver through a narrow tube, and the mechanism was connected to play. Pressing the key started the recording, then opened the container several seconds later, releasing its contents into the handset. Unknown residue remained inside. Samples went for chemical analysis and comparison with Sloan's tissues. There was no remote trigger. The device had been installed in advance and required no one nearby. Sloan had lifted the receiver, pressed play, and activated it himself. The cassette was intact, but the voice was buried beneath decades of noise. Lucas needed time to clean it. The cassette in the message photograph matched the type inside the machine, casing, color, and label position. That did not prove it was the same cassette, but the image had been chosen for a reason. The message came from a prepaid phone that disappeared from the network immediately afterward. At Sloan's office, his assistant gave me the files from his recent cases: infidelity, debt, a business partner check, and theft inside a transport company. Only one offered a motive. A week earlier, Sloan had exposed a warehouse manager selling company property through fake buyers. The man was fired, then threatened him. I found him at a small auto shop. He admitted the threats, but denied the murder. We found no connection to Riverside, the cassette, or the telephone. The theory explained why someone might want Sloan dead. It did not explain why anyone would draw him into an abandoned motel to do it. By the next morning, 3 employees and security footage confirmed the warehouse manager's alibi. Sloan's other current cases led nowhere. Then Lucas called. He had cleaned the recording. A man's voice said, "You should remember this place. The past does not disappear because people refuse to speak of it. Today, justice will be restored. No name, no case." So I searched Sloan's past. Before private work, he had spent years investigating murders for Dallas police. I searched the archive by the Riverside address. The first match was 22 years old. A 31-year-old woman named Claire Mercer had been found dead in the same room. Her husband, Thomas, was convicted and sent to prison. The lead investigator was Richard Sloan. For the first time, his death touched something specific in his past. The Claire Mercer file said she had arrived at Riverside with Thomas. They argued, he left her in the room, and several hours later, she was found dead. Investigators claimed Thomas returned and killed her. He denied it from the first interview through the trial. There were no witnesses and no direct evidence. The prosecution relied on the argument, his lack of a confirmed alibi, and statements detectives called inconsistent. It was enough. Sloan had led the case, built the timeline, and presented the central evidence. Thomas spent 22 years in prison and was released only months before Sloan died. The official file contained no mention of an audio cassette, but the pattern was clear. The same motel, the same room, the detective who secured the conviction, and the man who lost 22 years because of it. It did not make Thomas a murderer, but it gave me every reason to find him. Thomas Mercer was 56. Before prison, he had been a mechanical engineer. After release, he worked as a technician servicing industrial equipment. He was not at home, his car was gone, and the mailbox was almost empty. His supervisor described him as quiet, precise, and withdrawn. Several days earlier, Thomas had resigned without explanation. His work involved mechanical assemblies, fluid delivery systems, and electrical switches. He had the skills to build the device inside the telephone. Skills were not evidence. I requested the parts and equipment records from the weeks before he left. If Thomas had built the trap, something inside it might lead back to his workplace. The company repaired pumps and chemical delivery systems in an industrial yard south of the Beltway. By then, the residue inside the receiver had been identified, a volatile industrial reagent used at several sites serviced by the company. Small quantities were stored in bulk and not individually logged. Lucas also identified a component from the telephone, a small solenoid valve used to release liquid or gas for a controlled interval. The warehouse stocked the same model 3 weeks before Sloan's death. Thomas checked one out. 2 days later, he marked it defective and sent it for disposal. The scrap container had not yet been emptied. The valve was missing. We could not prove it was the exact component from the telephone. But the model, timing, and function matched. Thomas knew Sloan could build the mechanism, resigned days before the murder, and had removed the same type of valve used in the trap. That was enough for a search warrant. Thomas was gone when we searched his house. In the garage, we found tools, wire scraps, industrial components, and mounting tape matching the type used inside the telephone. Beside the workbench stood an old typewriter. On both motel cards, one letter sat slightly above the line. Thomas's machine produced the same defect. A full comparison still required an examiner, but doubt was disappearing quickly. There was no paper in the machine. Instead, a photograph had been placed beneath the paper guide. A young Thomas stood beside Claire near a small wooden lake house, both holding fishing rods. The photograph had been left in the most visible place in the garage. On the back was written, Thomas and Claire, Lake House, June 1987. This was not a forgotten family picture. It had been left where we were certain to see it. Old property records could tell us where the house stood. A year before Claire's death, the Mercers had bought a small lakeside property outside Dallas. After Thomas's arrest, it was rarely used, but never sold. We left before dawn. City streets gave way to an empty highway, then a narrow road through pine trees and a muddy track. The cabin stood at the water's edge, darkened by age, its roof sagging and dock half submerged, but it was not abandoned. Fresh tire tracks crossed the wet ground, chopped wood lay beside the porch, and smoke rose from the chimney. Thomas's car stood behind the house. He had not tried to hide it. We surrounded the property. Through the window, I saw him seated at the kitchen table, Claire's photograph in front of him. Thomas Mercer did not look surprised. He looked like a man waiting for us to follow the road he had left behind. Thomas saw us and made no attempt to run. He stood beside the table with his hands visible, unarmed, and allowed us to cuff him without resistance. He looked at Claire's photograph only once. The cabin held no tools or parts connected to the telephone. The clothing, food, and old photographs suggested he had arrived after the murder, perhaps to spend his final days in the only place untouched by prison. On the road to Dallas, Brooks called. Expanded toxicology found the same substance in Sloan's tissues, and inside the receiver, Sloan had inhaled the toxin while listening to the recording. At the station, Thomas did not deny building the device, installing it at Riverside, or sending the message. The garage, the missing valve, and the typewriter already tied him to the trap. But when I asked about the cassette photograph, something changed. That image was why Sloan had entered the motel alone, and why Thomas had waited more than 20 years for that day. Thomas finally explained the cassette. On the night Claire died, they argued at Riverside. He left her in the room and drove home. Later, Claire called from the motel and left a message on their answering machine, apologizing and telling him she loved him. The old file still contained a telephone log. A call from the room to the Mercer home had been placed after the time investigators said Thomas had left. The log could not prove who called. Claire's voice on the cassette could. The recording broke the prosecution's timeline. The next day, Thomas handed it directly to Sloan. It never entered evidence, was never mentioned in a report, and was never heard in court. Thomas never saw it again. His story explained what had made no sense. Sloan saw the photograph, canceled his meetings, and came alone because he believed the missing recording was waiting inside the telephone. That was why he locked the door, lifted the receiver, and pressed play. A man might forget the shape of a cassette. He would not forget what he had done with it. Sloan had already chosen a suspect and refused to let one piece of evidence destroy his case. Claire's real killer was never found. Thomas lost his wife, his freedom, and 22 years. What haunted him was knowing the truth had once been placed in another man's hands, and that man had chosen to bury it after release. Thomas no longer believed the law could repair the old case, so he restored justice as he understood it. The photograph became an invitation. The motel became a courtroom, and the recording became a sentence. Thomas had waited 22 years to deliver. Sloan did not send Thomas to prison because he failed to see the truth. He saw it and turned away. 22 years later, that choice returned to the same room. I could not excuse Thomas. He planned a murder and carried out his sentence. One man decided the law gave him the right to hide the truth. Another decided injustice gave him the right to kill. Both were wrong. Between them remained Claire, whose real murderer was never found. Thomas would probably spend the rest of his life where he had only recently escaped. He restored justice as he understood it, whether it was worth his final years of freedom. Only Thomas could answer. My task was to establish the truth, even if it came too late to save anyone.